Okay, how's everybody doing tonight? Good? We got rock signs, so that's a good sign. All right, so tonight we're going to talk about something that's important for the two active classes, and then it's important for everybody, which is worldviews and environmental assessment, which is a subject that is near and dear to my heart. Because this is stuff I'm working on quite a bit these days and had to work on the past 10 years or 12 years, I guess, now. In practice and more in theory now, I guess. So what are we talking about when we talk about, a world? Like, why is this an important thing that we need to consider? Anybody? Worldviews. We can kind of see it playing out. Beliefs and worldviews dictate action. Yes, we are in a global crisis, for sure. What kind of global crisis? Predetermines priorities. Everything's connected. Yep. What kind of global crisis are we in right now, Linda? Climate. Coronavirus. What else? Food, all kinds. Democratic, right? Biodiversity, yes. Economic. Poverty. God. Everything. I think we should stop this now. We're in a crisis all over the place, right? In fact, in viewing these things as a crisis, it is, in essence, a worldview, right? Some people are oblivious to the fact that we have a crisis going on, right? There's probably many people that don't view what's happening in the world right now as a crisis because they might have a different worldview. Maybe heavily localized, right? There could be a heavily localized worldview. It's hard to say. But the root cause, exactly as Cam is saying, is one of the issues that we're facing right now is that we are confronted with, and we see that increasingly there are diverging worldviews at play in the world, right? So we can see, for instance, in Russia and some of the Eastern Bloc countries, what is good governance versus not good governance, right? In terms of some of the elections. We can see in the United States, our neighbors to our south, you have pretty big different worldviews that are clashing politically, socially, racially, and so forth and so on. So these are really important things that we need to consider, but it's not just limited to politics and social phenomenon, though. It's actually a really important factor that we need to consider when we're working on environmental assessments. That have done EAs before or working on EAs, you may know what I'm talking about. You probably have experienced them, and you will in one way, shape, or form. Because even when you work on an environmental assessment and you're in an interdisciplinary team, so you're going to have like maybe the social scientists and the biologists and the chemists, so forth and so on, and the tech folks, the engineers, and then the legal people, and then the economic people. All of those different disciplines have kind of a different built-in worldview from a professional standpoint, from a disciplinary standpoint. And so one has to, if you're going to work in interdisciplinary teams, understand the foundational principles from which people come from, in terms of what is their background. That in itself, I think, is a huge subject that requires a lot of exploration, and I'm happy to do a podcast just on interdisciplinarity, because this is something that, again, I've been working on that for about 15 years, and work and just in theory, and it's something that you really need to explore. However, in our context, what we're looking at is more practical version. So we have to ask ourselves, what is a worldview to start with, right? So here's a good website. I'm going to put through some links, and these will be available on the downloadable note sheet. Speaking of which, I looked at all the links and have fixed them. There were some errors with the links on the video descriptions on YouTube. If you go to that website there, their definition of a worldview here is a worldview is a view of the world used for living in the world. It's a mental model of reality, a comprehensive framework and ideas of ideas and attitudes about the world, ourselves, and life, systems of belief, systems of personally custom theories about the world, how it works, with answers for a wide range of questions such as what can we know and how, and this is important for us. How do we know of things, and how do we know of, like, what can we know? Like, can we know about, say, sea surface temperature rise, right? Can we know about land degradation? And then how do we know it? Like, what is the method from which we know that? And with how much certainty can we know that? Right? So what is the degrees of certainty? Does reality include only matter or energy, or is there more? Some worldview questions are about God. So, you know, there's some big questions, but then there's some practical things. Now we're going to look at more the first part of that, which is what can we know and how? And then to what degree of certainty can we have with what we think we know, based on the process by which we come to knowing of something. So at the core of it, a lot of this is ultimately a philosophical question. Okay, so, and I like to go back to basics, and I gave a talk like this before as a podcast, and I'm going to use the same points that I raised then because they're that important. And there's a couple points in philosophy that I think are read, and you'll see if you look at philosophy in general. But I think it's important to raise them because they're just so fundamental. So one is epistemology. Is everybody familiar with the word epistemology? Have you heard of this before? Anybody? Yes, Linda has. Good. So if you haven't, here's a link for you, which is a good ways of knowing. Exactly. Good. So that will give you, I mean, there's a lot on epistemology, obviously, because there's a lot of works that have been using it, a lot of philosophers working on this forever and still working on it. But it comes from the Greek word episteme, for knowledge, understanding, or acquaintance. It's technically only a couple of centuries old, but it is as old as Western philosophy, and if not older. There was a different way of thinking about that before. And an epistemology can be something held cultural group. So for instance, like if you're working in a team of ecologists, and I've worked with a fair bit of ecologists, you know, there's different ways, epistemologies that even ecologists use, right? So what are some different epistemologies that an ecologist might use? What do you think? How would they know of nature? Uh, yeah, but more specific. We're assuming that you're using Western science. Are there any ecologists here? For one, some people might think that. Population ecology, right? They might look at an ecosystem and view it primarily based on the different populations of species. That's one kind of branch of ecology. It's one way of studying an ecosystem, right? What's another way? Do you know of another type of ecology? Natural selection would be a theory they would use, so technically, yes, that would make sense too. But community ecology, that's another group of ecologists, right? They believe that it's based on the community dynamics amongst different species and so forth. And then another one is ecosystem ecology. Boom, you read my mind, right? So me personally, I'm more on the ecosystem ecology side of things. That's where I had most of my training. And so ecosystem ecologists are a little more functional in terms of what they look at, how an ecosystem works, right? So we would study nutrient flows, nitrogen cycling, phosphorus cycling, mass and energy balances, water dynamics, all that kind of stuff. They look at it as a system and then try and understand how it works. Okay, so there are underlying characteristics of some bodies of knowledge, and Western science has its own. So for instance, Western science is a very hypothesis-driven understanding. It's one form of epistemology where you have a hypothesis and then you try and prove your hypothesis through experimentation and observation and so forth. Environmental science as a discipline is driven by different scientific disciplines that constitute it. So we have hydrology, ecology, atmospheric science, soils, geomorphology, blah, 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 blah. But its foundation is that of sustainable development. There's norms attached to environmental science, and it's often defaulted to a Western view of knowledge, a scientific epistemology. So one of the issues that has been, I wouldn't say it's plagued sustainability or environmental science to some degree, is that we've kind of relied on or defaulted to a Western body of knowledge for a lot of the development of this type of thinking for quite some time. And we'll get into that going forward. Another part of this way of knowing or worldview is ontology. Okay, what's ontology? So there's a way of knowing stuff, and then there's ontologies. That's epistemology, how we study things, how we know stuff. Yeah, more or less. That's a fair way of answering it. It's about existence, right? It's a study of what there is. Like, how do you define what there is? There we go. Yeah, the nature that exists. Like, how do we attach a meaning to something, right? So, like ecology or like an ecosystem. So one could say, I mean, one of the most basic ones in ecology is there a God, right? Does God exist? Is there a representation or an ontology of God? So this is a question of the universal definition of something. So nature, for instance, Julio's, that's a great example. How do you define nature? Nature is different things to different people. And it's the questioning whether or not something exists at all. So it's how you define something. Like I could say, okay, over there, that's a dog, right? Well, how is it a dog? Well, it has certain characteristics that we've defined within our kind of worldview that allows it to fit within that category of things in the world we would call the dog. Has 4 legs, blah, 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 blah. So taxonomy is closely related to that, right? So when we deeply consider the challenge of different ways of knowing, we are embarking on an epistemological and ontological journey, right? That's really the type of fundamental questions that we need to really resolve. And in order to do that, we consider all these different interacting factors that are that draw from culture, history, economic, and sociological dimensions, right? So in terms of our work in sustainable development, we're kind of at a crossroads, to be honest with you. And many of you, we talked about this the other night in environmental management, or in about environmental impact assessment. The nature of science is to some degree questioned, right? So what is science? And is science the most effective way of addressing some of these pretty fundamental questions that we have? Some call it post-normal science. There's other words for that, or questioning the ontology of science, so forth. And now, as we start to, in Canada particularly, we start to kind of unpack some of the challenges that we have, particularly related to reconciliation. We need to think about these things in a very significant way, and we'll get to that as we progress. So in Canada, when we go to this process of with a decolonialization or reconciliation, we have to think about epistemology and ontology and how we go about agreeing upon what is the collectively agreed upon way of knowing when it comes to, like in this case, when we're talking about natural resources, right? Now, in the past, this whole idea, which is quite an interesting kind of concept, is that the knowledge that has been gathered about nature has often been used as a means of domination and control, right? If you think about, say, colonials coming to North America and then documenting where there's different reserves of minerals and so forth, that was all driven through natural science. And ultimately it fueled, to some degree, some forms of colonialization. Not to some degree, in large part. So why is this relevant to impact assessment? Why do you think this is relevant to impact assessment? Anybody? Or is it not? Environmental assessment. Why do we need to think about ways of knowing? In order to understand impacts by another group. Exactly. Very good. Right, it's relative. Impacts on indigenous peoples, yes. Pascal, it depends on what point of view you're coming from. Determine impact, yes, exactly. So those in 415, I mean, you've been through this now. We've done a couple assignments. Those other folks that have been on other courses, you know that this isn't, we don't have a unified lens of the world, right? It's very diverse. So the point of environmental assessment ultimately is to assess more facets in scientific empiricism and Western epistemology to determine what is nature, how to preserve, conserve ecology, and note to human goods. Exactly, right? So in EA, what we try and do when we're doing an environmental impact assessment, for instance, is to look at the positive and negative impacts of a project, right? So we try and diminish the negative impacts and amplify the positive impacts, whether that be positive impacts being jobs or what have you, negative impacts often meaning impact on ecosystems and potentially on societies, right? So the question is then when we go through that like we've done, is what are these then? What are the environmental aspects? And what are the impacts associated with them? And therefore, what kind of domains of knowledge are required to assess them? So the thing is here, even science, quote unquote science, is relative, right? It's culturally embedded often. There's bias involved with it, and so forth and so on. Now, if we are talking about, to give you an example, if we are talking about the impact on spawning habitat, right? So say if we're doing a, I don't know, a project at the river, right, in British Columbia, and there's effluent that comes out of that, or maybe we're disturbing the land somewhat, and that is causing runoff of dirt and so forth, so siltation. We'd have to look at what's the impact on spawning habitat. Now there's a Western view, like Western scientific knowledge, that can help to inform us. But in addition, there are other forms of knowledge that are equally relevant in those kind of situations. And we would describe that as traditional ecological knowledge. And in some cases, we might even consider the broader term of indigenous cosmologies that may be used, right? Have you heard of TEK before? I imagine many of you had. Right. What is it? TEK? Traditional ecological knowledge. There you go. So TEK. So I want to give you a bit of the goods on TEK because it's here's some sources that you might want to look into. So I want to just root this in kind of theory. Number one, have you ever heard of Fikret Berkus? Anybody? So hypothetically, when I'm assuming that you're going to work on this stuff, or at least deal with it, what I highly recommend you do if you ever start to get called upon for this kind of work is start to ground yourself in the people that have been, in the work that a lot of people that have been working on this for a very long time have been producing. To me, that's the best way, in my experience, to get prepared and to understand. So I'm going to give you some authors here that I would recommend you take a look at. Okay, the first one is a gentleman by the name of Fikret Berkus. Okay, I'm going to write this down here. Okay, have you heard of that name before? Okay, good. If you get anything out of this thing tonight, this presentation tonight, that alone is worth your time. This gentleman is a legend in environmental studies, adaptive management, social and ecological systems. Fikret Berkus, you must remember that name, okay? That's your homework. Fikret Berkus. Fikret Berkus is at the University of Manitoba. He's a legend in this area. Much like, you know, if you're into philosophy, Arne Ness or, you know, someone like that would be. This is like, he's like the OG guy of traditional ecological knowledge, especially in Canada, particularly. So here's some of his work, and he's done a lot of work on all over the place, but particularly on fisheries. He's worked a lot on fisheries. So that first book there, I've literally got a book here we go. I've got one right here. This one I have right now, which I'm reading, is called Coasts for People. And that one's a good one to take a look at if you're looking at coastal stuff. Okay, that's a good one. Just one sec, I'll find a link to it. This guy, just a sec. Can I open my browser? Yes, that is the man. That's the guy. He's a University of Manitoba. Really, done a lot of stuff. Okay. First book there I'd recommend. I'm just going to take a look at this here. Make sure I have to put through the links myself to make sure I know which one. This one is, which book is this? Concept. Yeah, this is an original one. As a chapter in that book. It's just a good grounding in it. So I'd take a look at that. This next one here. This is a good article, and you can download this one. It's a chapter in a book, and I believe you can, if you even just, it's free, like you can just get access to it. Just one sec. Okay, that article there is a good one. Check it out. So this is the stuff I'd recommend you download, okay, and keep this in your whatever folder, your literature folder for this kind of stuff. Ecological knowledge, resilience, and sustainability. One with that article is Fikret Berkus, Carl Folke, and someone else I don't know. The third person, they've really tried to pull together resilience theory and traditional ecological knowledge. And if you've got into resilience, understand that it's really, really handy to try and to broaden the approach, because often when you work on those kind of projects that call for that resilience, you're dealing with Indigenous peoples, right? Like, say, for instance, in the Inuit and the resilience to climate change and so forth. So great article, worth the time to check that one out. This other one here, this is another good one. Again, it's a Berkus article. This one here. This is more tied to local understanding. So those of you that have done 586 with me would know about this sense of place, this idea of a sense of place. We all have this, right? So, where are you? Is anybody from the interior of BC, right? Anybody from the Kootenays? Living in Nelson. There you go. Okay, I was trying to get at that because that's where I'm born in Nelson. So, see, Trail, good. Nelson, okay. I'm a Kootenay bias guy, but there's a certain sense of place in the Kootenays, as there is in other locations. You just have this knowledge of the place. You've lived there for a long time and you've grown up there. So this idea of a sense of place is even more predominant when you're talking with groups that utilize a traditional ecological knowledge system. Why is that? Why do you think that is? God's country. That's what Trail, sure, and Nelson, yes. Why do you think it's important to consider sense of place when we think about TEK? Why do you think that's an important kind of corollary? It's a parallel factor we need to consider. Why is that? Exactly, but why though? You're getting there. I'm trying to, traditional plants and wildlife. Yes, but there's one thing that both of these I agree with. They're both connection to the land, knowledge of plants, but how is that fortified? Like, someone desire to learn, protect. Yep, all good. These are all, they're not exactly what I'm getting at though. Yes, because of what? Sustenance. And where did they learn that from? Where does this come from? Yes, exactly. traditions, their ancestors, and what kind of time frame are we talking about? Thousands of years. Long time, exactamente. It's a long time. I mean, these are developed from groups that have lived on the land and off the land, oftentimes for very, 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 very time immemorial is the typical way you refer to that. This is oral history that has been passed down, right? This is knowledge of the land cyclically over time, over seasons, from hunting, sustenance, and so forth, that has accumulated over very, very long periods of time. And this is one of the core arguments around the value of traditional knowledge versus Western science, and conveyed through oral traditions, exactly, oral histories, right? Mythologies in some case. So, I mean, it has stood the test of time, for sure. Okay. Here's another link. This is okay. I'm just going to throw, and all of these are going to be available for you in the PDF. This book here I would recommend strongly. This is the first place I would start. It's a book called Sacred Ecology by Burkus. Okay, so his work is a good base if you want to really kind of get into this stuff. Or let's say you start a project and there's a TEK component to it. This name is one you'd want to Google right off the way, another name that I think would be useful for you to know is Nancy Turner, okay, in terms of TEK in Canada, particularly on the West Coast. Okay, I'll write that out. Yes, she's fantastic. Nancy Turner. So, what's her, her, okay. What's her background, Nicolisa? What would you call her in terms of discipline? Yes, exactly. She's an ethnobotanist. So what is that? What's an ethnobotanist? What do they know? What do they study? Exactly. They study the ethnicity or ethnographic components of botanical stuff, biological products. Often the focus of ethnobotany is traditional use of indigenous plants, usually for medicinal purposes, but often for, it's used for other things as well, like just any kind of use of botanical products. So she is like a heavyweight in this area. Like she's one of the ones that UVic, I think, is last time her home base was. So here's an article by her, which I think is great. Okay. Okay. And traditional ecology. Yeah, this is a killer article. So this article here, Traditional Ecological Knowledge and Wisdom of Aboriginal Peoples in British Columbia. If you do anything in BC that involves TEK, here you go, okay? The other two authors on this are ones that I will get to after this, are from SFU, the Ignacies, and they have written tremendous work on Indigenous peoples from the interior and around the Caribou area of BC, Similkameen area. Okay, so she's one to look at. Here's another article. So we got Nancy Turner and we got Fikret Burkus. This is an interesting one as well. Now this one here is about more on the keeping the local, recalibrating the status of science and traditional and ecological knowledge in education. I brought this one together to the table because Michael Roth is a really interesting guy in terms of the educational space. He's at UVic, or was at UVic, and he's written a lot on, if you want to get into like the really philosophical side of this stuff, he's one of the guys you want to look at. Like really, really interesting character. Okay, so from an educational standpoint, that's a great resource to look to. So, question is, what is the basis of this? How do we derive this knowledge? Some of the base issues that we need to start with is, what is knowledge? How do we know of things? What are fundamental philosophical issues? What is a body of knowledge? So those are all the philosophical issues that come along with it. But we have to look at some of the different kind of ways in which this knowledge has been acquired, used, manipulated, and then how it impacts other people. So I'm going to give you some references that I think are useful quickly, as not just accounts of traditional knowledge, but the impact of traditional knowledge, or the impact of knowledge acquisition. Now, the first one here is a book called by Mary Louise Pratt. I've mentioned this before. She's a Canadian kind of anthropologist, I'd say, and talks about, her book here is Imperial Eyes, Travel Writing and Transculturation. This is a really, really interesting book. If you're interested in the way in which colonial processes work, she calls it the contact zone, where different cultures collide in the context of colonialization. Really good stuff. She's done some really interesting evaluation of colonial processes in South America, as well as in parts of Africa. This one here, next one is about the West Coast, the intemperate rainforest. This one here, this is a little more about, so if you're interested in knowledge as power and agency and so forth, this is one for you. This talks a lot about, like, say, the work of Foucault, deriving that kind of analysis of the use of knowledge and how, representation. Good. Okay, good. Nice contribution, in global environmental change. Excellent. Good stuff. This next one here is a beautifully written book by Charles Menzies. Okay, Menzies is an anthropologist from UBC. And this talks a lot about the Gitskan people in northern Vancouver Island area. They call them people of the saltwater. But I mean, you may not be working in that area or, interested for that matter, but I would recommend reading the book. It's a nice, smooth read. It's beautifully written. It's not huge. Great thing you can read on the weekend. This is the one, this one here is about the role of archaeology. So these mysterious people shaping history and archaeology in a northwest coast community. This is about the role of archaeology in uncovering sites that give us an idea of, what happened in the past, who came first, how are rights legitimized. So she talks a lot about the Marpole Midden, which is Marpole in Vancouver is a part of Vancouver, but it's actually, there's a big midden there. A midden is an archaeological site where there's like mounds of bones and stuff, right? And they did ethnographic studies. And that book talks a lot about, how archaeology and the finding of deconstructing of what has happened has been used in some ways to oppress people and in other ways to elevate people or to emancipate people. But it's really interesting there on the role of archaeology in this. And lastly, this book here is the one I had mentioned by the Ignacies, Land and Laws by Marianne Ignacy and Ronald Ignacy. This is in the interior of BC. This is a monster of a book. However, it's one of the most seminal pieces of work as a comprehensive account of Indigenous culture, particularly in the interior of BC. And it's an archaeological and cultural almanac of these people some 2,000 years before the present. And they did a tremendous job there. So these resources here, okay, are a good kind of foundation, and I'm really wanting to give you something to work with if you have to engage with this stuff. Okay, these are the types of resources, give you some base, not just in a superficial way. Okay, so the next question is, how do we apply this? So how do we do it in Canada, right? In Canada, we've actually become much more progressive and enlightened about how we're doing this now. I would say, at least that's my opinion. And in one thing that we have been doing is establishing advisory committees. So this is the Advisory Committee on Indigenous Advisory Committee for Impact Assessment. So we actually have established a committee of Indigenous folks who say, like, this is how impact assessment should occur, right? Which is fantastic, because, you know, we're not just a bunch of people who are, you know, non-Indigenous trying to articulate how that should happen. Now, even in the old school, so this is with the new impact assessment legislation, but even for 2012, the CEA 2012, this was what they had used, which was, this is one of the resources, or at least what they said it was being used. So if you go to that website, you will see how considering Aboriginal traditional knowledge and environmental assessments conducted there. So if you review that, you will see how the principles and what is Aboriginal traditional knowledge, and so forth and so on. So that's how it's interpreted in terms of impact assessment in Canada. 2012, last legislation was in effect, and then now, right? So the new way of approaching it, which can be seen here. So if you go to this website, this is currently how impact assessment is managed in terms of traditional knowledge, right? Crown consultation with Indigenous people in federal impact assessment. This walks you through how the Crown is to consult, like duty to consult, but then the actual knowledge part of it here outlines how traditional knowledge is utilized. Indigenous knowledge under the Impact Assessment Act, procedures for working with Indigenous people. So this really goes through the purpose, the introduction, so forth and so on. So useful resources actually from a practical standpoint. Okay. Now, what about the international scene? How do you think are there resources out there? Excuse me. One of the resources that I think is from UNDRIP. Yes, from a legal standpoint. Tiffany, yes, both right. So UNDRIP, UNDRIP, is the United Nations Declaration of Rights for Indigenous People. That is more of, you know, it's more of a statement of rights, right? That's really what it is. They don't and processes for gathering or utilizing traditional knowledge. Dictating that it should be used, yes, for sure. Now, Tiffany, UN, yes. So it's always a good source for this kind of stuff, but particularly the source that I highly recommend is this, which is the CBD's guideline for that. The CBD is the UN Convention for Biological Diversity, and what they have established there, if you go to that link, is what is called the Ecological guidelines for conduct impact regarding developments proposed to take place on or which are likely to impact on sacred sites and on lands and waters traditionally occupied or used by Indigenous and local communities. Boom, that's what we want, right? That hits it. So if you go through that guideline, you'll see, if you scroll down and you look at the introduction, they really go through what this is all about. And so, I mean, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but this is the de facto standard internationally. Like, a lot of people will defer to this when they say, look, we needed to do an impact assessment and we had Indigenous peoples involved, so we chose to use the Ecological guidelines, right? You'll see that quite often, right? So this, they have integration of cultural, environmental, social impact assessment as a single process. Cultural impact assessments, they go through all dimensions of it, so it's really good. So this way on this. So BC First Nations leading the way on this. Not on this one. This in terms of the use of the guidelines, I don't know. I'm not sure actually. I'd have to look at that. I don't know. I can't say. Said where's that? Let me see. I'm not sure. I can't answer that. Well, this is the voluntary gathering was named by a Mohawk term meaning everything in creation. So it's named after a Mohawk. Blah blah blah. I'm scanning this down. I don't know. I don't know. who is using this most prominently right now, but it's used all over the place. That's the thing. So it wouldn't surprise me if it's being used for the Chimchian. How do you say? Yeah, Chimchian. Or Haida as well. I mean, Haida are very progressive, you know. So this is stuff I've used actually with the Congo, with the pygmies, right? So yeah, I mean, this is a widely used standard, and I would recommend starting with that. And then, okay, so you start there, but then you need some of those that I've shown you, like say, you know, with the coastal groups or in the interior of BC. So for instance, I'm working on Bella Bella or Bella Coola right now. So this is something I'm working with. This books too. This is a classic. Like I have to read these. They're huge. I swear they're like, you know, a good 2.5 inches each thick. Massive piece of work. But what that gives you like such a detailed, thankfully we have that for some groups. Like Bella Coola is really well documented and other groups are as well. But if you have to go deep, that's where you go to. You really kind of dig into, you know, any kind of literature that will help you understand in a deep way what that worldview is constituted of, right? And so one other resource that I would like to share with you is this one. So this is just a great book, period. It's Gregory Cajete. Okay, so has anybody heard of Gregory Cajete before? Okay, if you haven't, there's a little YouTube video. It's probably about, how long? Only a few minutes long. So I'd check him out. You know, he's really interesting. Okay, so here, check that out. Now he's from the United States, from like the Navajo area, and so his work is largely deriving from those histories. But that book that I put through there, Look to the Mountain, is a great one. Like I've read that one, and he's produced some other great stuff. But the way he talks about, you know, indigenous knowledge and so forth is the perspective of indigenous worldviews, right? That's his kind of stance on things. And he does a really great job of communicating. So I would, you know, that's a good example. Now, you may not be working with the Navajo or in those areas, but nonetheless, I think it's a good example of documentation and articulation of that, as are some of the other books that I've outlined for you. So that allows you to go deep. You know what the policies, you know what the guidelines are in Canada and internationally. You know kind of the basis of this, which is really fundamentally about ontology and epistemology. And then you have some resources to look to in terms of the literature, but sometimes we need to even go deeper. So how would you go deeper if you were involved in working on something like this kind of stuff? How would you really try and establish a group that you were working with? There we go. Yeah. Consult elders or consult people in general, but elders particularly. Elders will tend to have, you know, community engagement. Yeah, elders, I mean, are going to have obviously the longer view of things, but I think even just engaging with the community in general, as Cam stated, is the way to go. So interviews are a good way to do that. You can do kind of informal or semi-structured interviews or whatever. Historical studies are useful, and those can be done through literature, but they can also be done by going through the archives and so forth. The archival record of different communities are helpful. Artifacts, etc. Even archaeology, as mentioned, has been a really effective way of determining like what is the basis for a worldview from a different community. All right, so to conclude then, co-management with groups and organizations. Yeah, and this would be a precursor to that. I mean, I think, yeah, I agree with you, like especially when you're involved in setting up co-management processes. you really need to, as say if you're the consultant doing that and you wanted to set up co-management systems, I would advise even before approaching that, try and get at, do a bit of a literature review of like who are the groups that you're dealing with, what's their worldviews, and what is the basis of it, what is it constituted of, and from there then you can like, okay, well good, I understand that they have this kind of certain cosmology about stuff. You can at least speak the same language. Yeah, it's essentially knowing your audience, because imagine if you're setting up a co-management agreement between First Nations and then commercial fishermen or fishers. The issue with knowledge transfer is integrating traditional knowledge properly. Traditional knowledge can get lost in the translation interpretation. Yes, exactly. And this is a tough one. Like, I can't claim to have a very good answer for that one, because this is stuff I'm literally working on right now, especially as we, especially if we try and roll in economics, as you know, Mona, which can be tricky to this discussion. An Aboriginal said there's a community providing culturally driven programs that are designed to support education. Excellent. Yes. So yes, traditional knowledge can get lost in translation. It can also be tokenism, right? We've got to be careful with that if there's been consultation that has not really been done at a deep or effective level. It's just basically just pacifying or because you have to do it. And I've seen that before. It's not a good look. I think be careful of that one. But yeah, it's important to take those steps. Now, does this mean that we're going to be able to effectively come to the right conclusion, or at least come to a conclusion everybody likes? Not necessarily, right? Now, a good example would be, I would say, oil and gas developments, pipelines and so forth that are going across British Columbia from Alberta, or similarly wherever. In some cases, you're going to have groups who are going to be impacted by those projects who just have a fundamentally different worldview. In their view, those kind of projects are contributing to the degradation of Mother Earth, and therefore, are not a good idea. Period. End of statement. And that's their worldview. That's it. Whereas others, even Indigenous groups, may have a more practical view of things and look at the nuanced trade-offs. Right? Well, we can gain these factors like economic development, jobs, futures, so forth, from these kind of projects, and we're willing to kind of compromise on those issues. So those issues emerge and come out in the negotiations and discussions. But before you get to that point, it's useful to really try and look at these fundamental issues around epistemology and ontology, and then cultural context for them, to allow you to really, as Jason was saying, know your audience, know who you're dealing with, and then at that point, then you can really, step into it. Now, I'll give you a personal story. I didn't do this one time because I didn't know it would be there. I was doing and I may have told this story to people. A lot of you haven't heard this one. I was in 2010 presenting on a project we're doing in the Congo, which was a forest reforestation, afforestation project for carbon sequestration, and then also growing things. It's a really good project, and like in terms of social benefits and so forth, locals that are working in the farm, like empowered through the gains of it. And we presented this at a UN conference for biodiversity, the COP conference, COP10, on a side event, which was filled with ministers from the DRC and then other donors. And this is when you're at these events, they're like government people, and then international government people, and NGOs, and then donors, or at least kind of working for groups that finance this stuff. So you got to be on your toes for sure. And this is the first time I'd had to do a presentation in that kind of an environment. So talk about throwing someone into the fires. It was, I presented the carbon program, went well, but then out of the blue, this voice came screaming in the room, which was it wasn't a huge room, probably about 35, 40 people, side event type thing. Access to what was it? Because I was talking about access and benefit sharing. Access to who? For what? This is what was being yelled at the top of this person's lungs. And as it turned out, this gentleman who was yelling that was from the Pygmy nation of the Congo. So the indigenous groups of the Congo The main one are pygmies. Literally, they're smaller people, and so he was there to represent their interests, and calling out and saw our presentation, and they weren't impacted by our project. However, their point there was to make sure that any projects in the Congo that were presented, or at least talked about, that I guess this was their point, was that there was the audience really understood that they had rights, and that largely, as I understand it, has to do with historical maltreatment and so forth that they've experienced. So we had to, like, I was freaking out because I didn't know much about that. We were working from Montreal. I was just dealing with the stuff. We hadn't decided. No indication from me that there was any impact on Indigenous peoples from this project. So I just kind of stood there shell-shocked, like, oh my, because there's like the Prince Albert and Monaco foundations in this room. All the ministers from all the agencies are there. Like, I screw up, the whole project gets screwed up. So I just kind of like was taken aback. But fortunately, my colleague talked to him, calmed him down, and we explained that the nature of what we were doing is for the locals largely, and then afterwards we met with them. But it wasn't until we had that kind of conversation about where we were both coming from that we were able to resolve those issues. Now, those kind of things can quite easily happen when you deal with these projects. And my advice is, or what I would suggest is, to just, before you step into those situations, have an idea of who the different audiences are, stakeholders, what their motivations might be, and what their worldviews are. And we've talked a lot about the worldview side of this tonight, because that is going to help you better understand where they're coming from, and then also, help you functionally determining what you might need to use. Will you need to use different methods for assessing impacts and so forth? Okay, so that's a kind of a really, really broad view of and high-level view of worldviews and environmental assessment. What it gives you, I think, is kind of a roadmap to look at how you might deal with these kind of issues if you're presented with them as a starting point, by looking at some of this literature and some of these guidelines. Okay? Anybody have any questions? So tonight, Fikret Berkis, number 1. Number 2, what's the other person you should remember? Her name starts with N. Nancy Turner, you gotcha. Fikret Berkis, Nancy Turner. The Ignacies are excellent resource. We have Charles Menzies, that was one I discussed. Gregory Cajete, Van Halen, Eddie Van Halen, traditional knowledge of the guitar. He's dead today. Do you know that? God, that's just so sad. God, I mean, I should play some Van Halen to close this thing off. I'm going to do that. How about that? I'll do that. I'll stop recording before I do that so I don't get in copyright trouble. That's sad. Cancer, wasn't it? I just saw it pop up. God, life's short, hey? That's my era, by the way. Like, I remember Van Halen. I listened to Van Halen. What do you think my favorite Van Halen album is? We're Not Here Forever. Exactly. Nope. Wrong, Jason. Good guess, though. At least you got a right album. Great album. What's better, though? Self-titled album. Van Halen, Van Halen. That's my fave. That may even be before you guys' time. But that is my favorite, Van Halen, Van Halen. If you want a Van Halen album, one, in my opinion, that would be the one to get. Jumps a close second. Okay, and I'm going to end with that. Any other questions? We are not here forever, right? Life's short. Do stuff you like to do. help others, live life. It's important. Okay, I'm going to stop recording.